Have you ever wondered why some cities in the United States have Spanish names? Las Vegas, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. It's because this territory originally belonged to Mexico, which was lost to the United States after the Mexican-American War. In today's video, I will talk about the war between Mexico and the United States and its consequences. In 1703, during President Thomas Jefferson's administration, the United States purchased Louisiana from France, which at the time was much larger than the state of Louisiana is today, and the country nearly doubled in size. This was right at the beginning of the 19th century, and the start of the century was marked by the idea of manifest destiny among Americans. In summary, manifest destiny was the belief that Americans were destined to expand their territory across all of North America because they were a chosen people by God to bring civilization to these lands and share their way of life with the peoples living there. Just as the United States purchased Louisiana, they tried to buy California, which at the time belonged to Mexico. There were rumors that California was a blessed land and would bring great wealth. In 1810, Mexico began a war of independence against Spain, which lasted for 11 years. The country gained its official recognition in 1821, and at the time, it had a much larger territory than it does today, including not only California, but also what are now Nevada, New Mexico, and Texas. Mexico refused to sell California, and the Americans started by offering $5 million and even raised it to $25 million. But still, the Mexicans wouldn't agree. The Mexicans already suspected that the region could have great potential someday. With this in mind, the Mexican government began selling land to settlers, aiming to populate the northern part of Mexico. However, right after independence, the country faced a major crisis of political and financial instability. To make matters worse for the Mexican government, many American settlers established themselves in the Texas territory, and it didn't take long before Texas declared its independence and became a republic. The Texas Revolution and the Republic of Texas, along with its conflicts, are topics for another video on this channel. However, as you may already know, this event further destabilized Mexico. Later, after declaring independence from Mexico, Texas opted to be annexed by the United States through a referendum. Mexico did not accept this and still hoped that Texas would return to being part of its territory. But Mexico never succeeded in reclaiming Texas. For the Mexicans, Texas was a rebellious state, so the Mexican government did not recognize this annexation and severed diplomatic ties with the United States. In 1845, James Polk, a supporter of territorial expansion, became president of the United States. Polk's main goal was to acquire California, and he even sent an American representative to negotiate the purchase of the territory with the Mexican president. But the leader refused to meet with the representative. James Polk was very displeased with this and vowed to himself that he would obtain California one way or another. After the Texas War of Independence, a treaty was signed in which it was established that Mexican troops would withdraw to the other side of the Rio Grande, and the United States understood that all the land on this side of the river was Texas, and therefore it now belonged to them. However, when Texas was part of Mexico, it was located on the other side of a different river, farther north, the Rio Nueces, and the Mexicans understood that only the land on the other side of this river belonged to the United States. The area between the Rio Grande and the Rio Nueces became a disputed region because while the Americans believed the Texas boundary was the Rio Grande, the Mexicans believed it was the Rio Nueces. It was then that Major General Zachary Taylor was assigned to move troops into the territory beyond the Rio Nueces, but not cross the Rio Grande, exactly the territory that was being disputed. When the Mexicans learned about this, they were enraged, as they saw the Americans as trying to take more territory. As a result, the Mexican government decided to send troops to the region. This led to a conflict between the two forces, and some Americans were killed. Major General Zachary Taylor informed the president that he and his troops had been attacked by the Mexicans. The Mexicans claimed that the land was theirs and that the Americans had invaded. After this attack, the Mexican soldiers moved to the Rio Grande, where they surrounded the American fort, known as Fort Texas. This was all a trap set by President James Polk. James Polk started saying that American blood had been shed on American soil, sparking outrage in the United States. This allowed him to gain support for a war against Mexico. The political debate became heated, with members of the Democratic Party supporting the war, while members of the Whig Party opposed it. Remember that the Republican Party didn't exist yet. It would emerge later when the Whig Party split. Some say that James Polk, who owned several slaves, wanted to expand the territory southward to increase the number of slave-friendly states. Some American politicians sided with Mexico regarding the border issue and found it absurd to start a war against their neighboring country. However, the debate was won by those who supported American expansion, arguing that it was Mexico that attacked first. The war was declared on May 13, 1846. Important military figures were sent to fight in this war, such as Winfield Scott, who would later run for President of the United States, Robert Lee, the Confederate military leader during the Civil War, which would occur a few years later, Stonewall Jackson, one of Lee's main allies in the Civil War, and Ulysses Grant, who would later become President of the United States. Zachary Taylor himself, who led the march beyond the Rio, also invested in a political career after the war and became President of the United States after James Polk. The first major battle of the Mexican-American War was the Battle of Palo Alto. Despite having more soldiers, the Mexicans suffered more casualties and withdrew. The following day, a new battle occurred, the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, and the same result happened. The Mexicans had more men but suffered more casualties and withdrew again. After these military defeats, Mexican President Mariano Paredes y Arrillaga was deposed, and it became necessary to bring in a prominent leader to head the Mexican army. That's when they thought of one of the most important political figures in the country, Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had fought for Mexico's independence and had served as president several times, some for only a few months. At the time, Antonio López was a controversial figure in Mexico. While he had many admirers, he also had many who hated him. This was because during his last presidency, he ruled as a dictator, which led to increasing opposition, and he ended up being imprisoned and later exiled in Cuba. James Polk, knowing that Antonio López still held some influence in Mexico, sent American envoys to Cuba to hold a secret meeting with him. In this meeting, it was agreed that the United States would allow López to pass through the naval blockade they had imposed on Mexico, so that he could enter the country and persuade the Mexicans to negotiate and cede land. However, when Antonio López landed in Mexico, he did not follow through with the agreement and instead began leading the Mexican army in several battles against the American forces. James Polk then decided to send more troops to further reduce the Mexicans' chances. The American attacks mainly originated from Texas and spread to what is now New Mexico and later to California. Mexico was a poor country with a less powerful army, and all the major battles of the war were won by the United States. The American soldiers were better trained, nourished, and armed, and they almost always had more men in battle, with a few exceptions, such as the battles of Buena Vista and Rio Sacramento. In fact, during the Battle of Rio Sacramento, the Americans had fewer than 1,000 men, while the Mexicans had over 4,000 soldiers. Despite this, the Americans managed to win, suffering fewer casualties and even capturing Mexican soldiers and supplies. Despite all these defeats, the Mexicans refused to negotiate peace, which led the Americans to plan for taking the country's capital. A naval operation was carried out in Veracruz, transporting thousands of soldiers who then headed west with the goal of capturing Mexico City. The Mexicans tried to stop them, and on April 18, 1847, The Battle of Cerro Gordo occurred, with the Americans emerging victorious once again. While hundreds of Mexicans died in each battle, only dozens of Americans were killed. Even with the support of the St. Patrick's Battalion, the Mexicans were unsuccessful in the battles. This battalion, mainly composed of Irish immigrants but also other Catholic Europeans, preferred to fight for Mexico due to their stronger religious affinity. In addition to this reason, there was also the issue of the disrespect these immigrants faced when arriving in the United States, as well as a greater financial advantage in fighting alongside Mexico. Two major attempts were made to stop the invasion: the Battle of Molino del Rey and the Battle of Chapultepec. Chapultepec Castle, which served as a sort of fortress, was captured by the Americans. In this battle, 6 boys, aged between 13 and 19, refused to retreat and were killed trying to stop the American advance. They are still remembered in Mexico today as Los Niños Héroes. This defeat sealed Mexico's fate. On September 14th, the Americans entered Mexico City. There was resistance, but nothing that could stop them. The Mexican flag was taken from the presidential palace and replaced with the American flag. Antonio Lopez, who was the president, resigned from his position but wanted to continue commanding the army and aimed to keep fighting the Americans. However, the soldiers' morale was low, and they no longer wanted to fight. The new Mexican government demanded that Antonio Lopez step down from the army's command and agreed to negotiate with the Americans. After Mexico's surrender, American politicians and military leaders began debating whether it would be feasible to annex all of Mexican territory. In the end, the Americans reached a consensus that if they took all of Mexico, they would have to deal with numerous revolts, something that would wear down the United States in the long run. However, if they only occupied the northern part, which was much less populated and was what they had originally wanted, this problem would be much smaller. Another reason was that some American politicians did not want to interact with the various races that made up the Mexican people and their many cultures. So, on February 2nd, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, officially ending the conflict. It was established that Mexico would cede the northern part of its territory to the United States in exchange for $15 million and the settlement of some debts. The defeat was humiliating, and the atmosphere in Mexico became terrible. While the United States expanded its territory by 25%, Mexico lost nearly half of its own. Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming became part of the United States. It was agreed that the southern border of Texas would be defined by the Rio Grande, but border disputes and confrontations between the armies continued. James Polk left the presidency, having accomplished his main goals. Today, the GDP of California and Texas are larger than that of Mexico as a whole, and both states are fundamental parts of the U.S. economic engine, whether through natural resource extraction, the film industry, or technology. This territorial gain brought consequences for the United States. The arrival of new states intensified the debate between slave states and free states, as they tried to maintain a balance between the number of each. And this was one of the main factors that led to the American Civil War. But that is a topic for another video. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like to support my work, and I'll see you in the next video.